Well, hello everyone. As Amber said, my name is Jed, and I am a consultant. And previously in my line of work, I used to work for the Corporation for National Community Service. I also worked for Volunteer New Hampshire, an AmeriCorps alumni. What else have I done? I've worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign. I've done a lot of stuff with managing volunteers. And so today we're going to be sort of going through some of the things that I've learned. But I think some of this will be helpful in terms of recruiting volunteers, retaining volunteers, engaging your volunteers, and understanding some of the dynamics that are at play. So um, before we get started here, I'm just going to jump into some of the highlights that we're going to be talking about today. One of the things that I'm really going to spend a lot of time on is really what are the generational differences that exist when we're thinking about recruiting volunteers from every generation. So generational trends, also taking a look at the use of social media and technology in today's world and how we utilize that to recruit and retain volunteers. And we're going to be talking about sort of what you can do in terms of thinking about reaching out and engaging these folks. So we're going to play a quick little game. This will take a few minutes, but sort of an icebreaker to get us started. So it's pretty simple. What generation are you? If you have a pen and paper handy, it might be helpful to keep score here. And maybe you can put your answers in the chat when we conclude with this. But a couple of questions to ask yourself to sort of determine what generation you're from. Most of the time, this is pretty accurate. There are exceptions to the rules where we always have a boomer who thinks they're a millennial and like scores really high on the millennial side of things. But real quick, if you could just answer some of these questions, keep score. If you answer any of these correctly, like if you confirm one of them for you, there's a point system for each one of them. And at the end, we'll tally up the scores and see what you got. And Amber, I can't see the chat, so maybe you could monitor and let me know like when people give a thumbs up, but we'll give it like 10, 15, 20 seconds to give people a chance to answer these. Some of these are really funny. Like, do you watch videos on YouTube? Pretty much everyone does. This is becoming less. I've been doing this presentation for like the last 3 or 4 years, and it's becoming less and less relevant in terms of the social media side and distinguishing folks on a generational trend based off of their use of social media, because everyone is using social media now. But we'll see what happens. All right. Next set of questions. Have you paid for and downloaded music from the internet? I remember when we used to do that. I think I was probably like at the tail end of that movement, like when people used to give like iTunes gift cards to people and you used to buy iTunes music. I also downloaded a lot of illegal music as well. I was also part of the last generation who did that, like put like illegal songs on CDs, and most people don't even know what CDs are anymore, or we've just forgotten. And if you blog, then that's even more impressive. All right, next set of questions. So make sure you're just keeping score if you can, either in your head or on a piece of paper. Have you visited MySpace? I remember when MySpace was a thing too. Facebook is becoming the new MySpace, which is sort of weird. But Facebook, as you'll see, is being used primarily by Xers and boomers. Actually, a lot of millennials are still using Facebook, but it's less and less. It's like the millennials on the tail end of like late 30s, early 40s. Yes, millennials are becoming entering the 40-year-old age bracket. All right. So hopefully you all have had a chance. I think there's one. All right. Amber, is anyone like need a little bit more time, or I think we're good probably?
Definitely the numbers have been coming in, and they might sort of as people are adding them up, but a lot of now some sixes and a lot of fours, 3, 12, 8, 8.
Okay.
5.
Well, here's the scores that you could be using to like sort of determine where you fell. Some of you may have gotten like 15, 16.
I think maybe some people were tallying up before we got all the questions out. So coming as they went.
Did anyone get a score that doesn't represent their generation?
You have a yes on that one?
Maybe somewhere between baby boomer and Generation X. Although my parents are deceased, so that wasn't a.
So you're in between boomer and X. And do you mind me asking what generation you're actually from?
Boomer.
Okay.
1958.
Pretty
I'm a
close.
boomer too.
So it's interesting, right? That like by asking a series of, I think it's like 15 questions, you can sort of determine where you're at in terms of generation and not even know the person. But just keep that in mind as we move forward here. All right, so, and I'm gonna push that over a little bit. Okay, boom.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
At some point I've noticed I just stopped caring about connecting. I mean, I've had to because I'm an artist and self-employed in other lines of my life, but
Yeah.
There's an overload point, which probably dates me as well,
In terms of like social media use?
Yeah.
I would agree. Unfortunately, Roger, you and I are in the minority when it comes to that as a society. So most people are very, very much tapped in. But we'll get into why that's important in a second here. But in terms of like recruiting volunteers and such, it's super important to understand some of these trends, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But real quickly, I just want to highlight the importance of nonprofits in New Hampshire. So most of you are probably from New Hampshire, and if you're not, you might be from Vermont or Maine. And some of the trends that we see in Vermont and Maine, we also see in New Hampshire. They're very closely related. But some of this data is a little old, but it's fairly close to being accurate. There's about 10,000 organizations registered as charities or a nonprofit in New Hampshire. And it's increasing by 200 organizations per year for the last several years now. And so there's just a heavy reliance on nonprofits in New Hampshire. We have a very small government in New Hampshire. The state relies on volunteers and nonprofits to do a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to supporting individuals that have special needs or are impoverished or underserved. And one interesting thing is that almost 80% of New Hampshire nonprofits report revenue less than 100,000. So that speaks to the fact that these nonprofits are heavily reliant on volunteers. As we say here, they're very dependent. Governor Johnson knew this is kind of a cool quote from him, but if all the volunteers didn't show up one day, the state could not function. In New Hampshire in 2015, there was about 330,000 volunteers. Those numbers are a little outdated. I'm sure they've gone up since then. And gave almost 40 million hours of service valued at almost $1 billion. And almost 30% of the residents in New Hampshire volunteer, ranking it in the top 20. I think it's even higher than that now. I think it's like in the top 18 the last time I checked. But very reliant on volunteers. Volunteers are sort of the lifeblood of nonprofits, because hence the name nonprofit. They're not invested in making a lot of money and increasing their bottom line, really, and they're invested in doing service and doing work that has a charitable outcome. So volunteers are heavily relied on. But nonprofits are definitely struggling. There's, obviously cash flow is a really important issue to highlight when we're thinking about the status of nonprofits as they stand here today. We've had unprecedented growth due to crises such as the opioid crisis. COVID-19 has increased demand as well. There's a lot of folks that are in leadership positions in nonprofits that are retiring. So 3 out of 4 nonprofit executives will retire in the next 5 years. And about 50% of nonprofits have less than 1 month of operating reserves. So if it got bad and cash flow sort of stifled, a lot of nonprofits would be in trouble. So it's important that when we're thinking about nonprofit management and thinking about how we can support the nonprofits that we work in and make sure that they are sustained and that they have longevity, that the things that you can control, like volunteers and trying to have a steady flow of good volunteers that you can rely upon, is something that you have as a constant. So volunteers are definitely filling the gap. One way that, as I said, nonprofits can survive is to have a steady volunteer base. To recruit and use volunteers effectively, volunteer managers need to understand current volunteer trends. That's probably one of the more important statements that I'm going to make today. One of the craziest things that you should be thinking about in terms of a volunteer manager is that the number one reason people don't volunteer is not because they don't want to volunteer, it's because they haven't been asked or they don't know where to serve. So no one ever asked them. That's an important phrase to take away from here today. So if you don't ask, you will not receive. So the success of your nonprofit is dependent upon your ability to recruit, engage, and retain a strong volunteer base. So one of the important aspects of understanding how to recruit, retain, and engage volunteers is understanding the trends. You have to get rid of the one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to recruiting and engaging your volunteers. All generations matter. Successful volunteer engagement really does depend upon understanding generational gaps. There are major differences between generations. And it seems like those differences continue to grow every single year. But if you want to recruit and retain volunteers, you need to understand that there are very important and key differences between generations. And those differences are not something to be highlighted in a negative way. They're actually something that I look at as a positive, because I actually think that each generation brings a unique aspect to the environment when they volunteer, when they work, and they all are coming with a unique set of skills and ideas that ultimately, if you are able to operate and understand and work with those generations and all those folks that represent those generations, you're going to create a more cohesive and diverse environment in your nonprofit. So just so that we're clear on dates, a lot of people confuse this, but there's really 5 generations that are working together right now. This is the first time ever in U.S. history that we've had 5 generations working together. But we've got traditionalists that are they were born between 1930 and 1945. We've got baby boomers, 1946 to 1964. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1976. Millennials, 1977 to 1994. Some people put it around 95, 96, but this is a common number too to see 94 here. And then after 1994, I like to say it's between 94 and 96, we get Gen Z. So generational demographics in the US right now, the largest generation in the US right now in terms of demographics is millennials at about 22%, following closely behind with baby boomers, and Gen Z is very, very close. A few years ago, Gen Z was a little bit higher in terms of her percentage, but right now we're seeing millennials, boomers, and Gen Z is taking up the largest share of population in the US, with almost 22% being millennials. So let's talk a little bit about Gen Z. So what are some of the characteristics of Gen Z? How can we think about how we are supposed to engage and recruit folks from Gen Z? But Gen Z, like I said, born between 94, 95, 96 to 2015, age 4 to 24, there's nearly 75 million in the US. Like I said earlier, about 20% of the population, 50% are looking for a job in volunteering. So that's a really, really important thing to be thinking about. And before I move any further here, what do you think is the most relevant generational characteristic of Gen Z? And you can just pop some answers in the chat. You can unmute yourself too. One thing I probably should have said right off the bat is I actually really like it when people unmute themselves and talk. So feel free to just blurt out some answers.
Online connection.
Online connection. It's a good one.
Get in the chat. We have technology. They care about social justice, activism, still living at home.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed the high school students that I have involved really don't like to communicate with text or email, which is interesting.
Yeah, it is. Work that matters to them. Yep, these are all really good answers. Care about social justice. Yep, activism. Still living at home. A lot of millennials are still living at home too. Work that matters. Yeah, absolutely. These are all really good answers. Okay. And feel free to, like, if you have any questions, just unmute yourself, interrupt me. I will not be offended. All right, Gen Z. So the touch screen generation. So, I mean, this generation is really unique in terms of the fact that it is pioneering really a new frontier in terms of how we communicate and how we think and how we talk, right? Because this was the first generation that was born on one of these, right? The iPhone. I'm a millennial. I can remember when there were no touch screens. I remember my first phone. It was like a Nokia, and it was a track phone. And I had to like go to Walmart to get like a phone card and then download the information and activate it. And I would get like, for like $40, you get like 120 minutes. And then you'd have to keep track of your minutes. I'm like right at the cusp, and I'm 28. I'll be 29 this month, but right on the cusp of this change in technology. And really, it's a huge leap, right? And I like to say it's a quantum leap forward in terms of our evolution as a society, because going from, one of those Nokia brick cell phones that I got at Walmart out of a box that it's so heavy, it could be like a murder weapon, to what we have today with literally a computer in your hand that's a touchscreen computer that could unlock all the information in the world that you would like to have access to, is a huge, huge leap forward. Some might say it's a leap backwards. I tend to agree, maybe. But it's a leap forward in terms of technological advancement. So many Gen Zers received their first phone when they were 10 years old. I didn't receive my first phone, and I had to buy it myself. I think it was like 16, 17, or 18. I didn't get an iPhone until I was like 22. I think a lot of millennials could probably relate. But Gen Z, very, very different. I walk around the streets nowadays and I see kids that are like little babies, like carrying a phone around, like an iPhone. So it's a very, very different generation in terms of like their access to technology. They were born on the internet, born with a touchscreen, average a lot of time on their mobile device, 3 hours a day on their phone. And that's an average, which I would say is probably even higher than that if you took the median scores. Are 25% more likely than millennials to say they're addicted to their digital devices. And this is funny too, because you always hear boomers and Xers complain about millennials, and millennials are, in my opinion, becoming more like Xers and boomers than when you compare them to Gen Z, because Gen Z is much more active online than millennials are. A full 40% of Gen Z self-identify as digital device addicts. 92% have a digital footprint, meaning they're on social media, they exist online, which is very different from previous generations. So we'll continue on here. Characteristics and needs. So one of the interesting things to point out here is that Gen Z was born into an era of chaos, right? Like they were born right before 9/11, which were like close to the 20-year anniversary of 9/11, which is insane. I remember like it was yesterday. Motivated in terms of like career-wise, they have a very different trajectory in terms of the way that they're thinking about their career, right? They're not going to college. College is not like the next step out of high school for a lot of Gen Z, at least in terms of the way that they're thinking about their career. Not as motivated by making a difference as millennials. Certainly they care about social justice issues, like millennials do as well, but I would actually associate justice issues and activism more with millennials than I would with Gen Z. Gen Z is much more independent in terms of thinking about themselves as an individual in society and less as a part of society. Very invested in their identity and their own brand. You're seeing a lot of like social media giants now that are like TikTok stars, and they're 16 and 17 years old, and they're like making tens of millions of dollars, and they're literally just promoting their own brand, right? Because they've either one, learned how to manipulate the online market, or two, have a specific skill that they market out. It's very interesting too, because with Gen Z, they have sort of navigated the choppy waters that is like online advertising, online marketing, and they've skipped the middleman in terms of like going and hiring a consultant, going and hiring a marketing team to promote themselves. They do it all themselves, and now we have the tools to do it ourselves. So consultants, marketing consultants, general consultants, um, even like having a physical business is becoming less relevant. You can really manage your entire world online, and Gen Z is really, really savvy when it comes to that. Self-learners, again, having access to the internet and all of the information that is available at their fingertips makes accessing that information so much more easier, and you don't have to go to higher ed or to institutions anymore. Very skeptical of institutions as well. Multitaskers, short attention spans, even shorter than millennials, which is hard to believe. But 4 seconds or shorter is really, it's funny now too. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but on a lot of news articles, they give you at the top of the headline how long it takes for you to read through it, which is something that the New York Times, Washington Post has had to adjust to, because people don't like to sit there and scan an article for 15 minutes. They want to know like how long it's going to take them to get through, and a lot of that is influenced by Gen Z, which is a big part of our society now, almost 20%. Millennials, so 22% of the population, the largest demographic. Millennials like to volunteer, right? 22% of millennials volunteered nationally in 2015. They represent 17 million volunteers. I think it's a little higher now than the last time I did this research. 3 out of 10 believe that citizens have a very important obligation to volunteer, which is a pretty good number. And where do millennials volunteer? Education, youth, community service, that sort of thing. What do they like to do? Pretty much everything, but mostly direct service. Millennials like to see, like, they like to interface between individuals, which makes doing the virtual world kind of tough. But also big on giving. 85% give to charity. And speaking as a millennial, I definitely can attest to this, because I mean, and this is really, this is something to take away. If you're running a nonprofit, a volunteer organization, a charitable organization, you need to have a place on your website or online somewhere that makes it easy for someone to click a button and make a direct link between their bank account and the work that you're doing. If you don't have that easily set up, and you're using like outdated, there's like some outdated technologies that people use and organizations use that make it really tough to give. It should be just like clicking a button, because millennials will just click a button and give $5. And if you can get those subscriptions every month, and I mean, take a look at what the market is doing right now in terms of entertainment, right? No one is going to pay for cable in like 10 years, right? Because everyone just has a subscription. No one pays for music anymore because everyone just has a subscription. No one, like the same thing with the gym. Apple Fitness just came out where you can pay for a subscription to have like a personal trainer in your living room every day. That's the world that we're living in. So you have to move to that model if you're a nonprofit or charitable organization, and you need to make a direct link and make it super clear like where their money is going. Characteristics and needs, definitely tech savvy, mobile first approach, right? I'll say this, I have multiple laptops floating around in my apartment, and I much prefer to just use my phone for everything. If I can answer an email on my phone, that's the way I'm going to do it. I prefer messaging, texting. Gen Z, like Roger, I think you mentioned it. A lot of the students that you work with don't like to even text. And I work with a group of students too. One of my clients that I work with is FEMA, and we run the Youth Preparedness Council. And all of them are between the ages of 12 and 17, and none of them like to text. They all like to use like messaging apps, like Messenger or Instagram Messenger. They're on that more than, and a lot of teens too don't even have like a cell phone number. Like they just have a device, and then they're able to connect to Wi-Fi, or they have data, and then they just use their mobile apps to communicate. I think millennials are less that way. We still like to text, we still like to call, but we definitely use like the internet and social media. Um, Not as big on email or voicemail, and that is totally true. Like my voicemail, and I used to work with Emily, so she could probably attest to this, but my voicemail was always full. Like I always had like 35 messages on my voicemail because I just hate to check voicemail. And I'm surprised when people even say that they have a voicemail, because it's so outdated, but a lot of people still use it, just not millennials or Gen Z.
You know, Gen
yeah.
Z maybe don't use phones, so their parents can't monitor them. They don't need to know.
What?
They don't have a phone number, so their parents can't control their phone time.
Oh, that might be correct. I have no idea, but that seems like it's would be
Pretty savvy.
Yeah, it's pretty savvy, and they're very strategic people, so it wouldn't surprise me. In terms of what drives millennials, it's similar to Gen Z, but we are very, very much focused on a cause, or having meaning or purpose in our work, right? Millennials represent like one of the highest turnover rates in terms of in the workforce, because if they don't feel like their work has meaning or purpose, or it's not tied to some sort of statistic that represents the impact that they're having on the planet, then they're just not interested. Not as loyal to brands or to organizations, and they judge institutions on their own merits, right? So this is a really interesting point too, because you'll have organizations like the Food Bank, the Red Cross, the United Way, like, brand name charitable organizations, and sometimes they struggle to recruit millennials and Gen Z. And the reason being is because if you said the Red Cross or the United Way to an Xer or a boomer, they would see that as like a prestigious landmark that they could like attach to themselves. Like, oh, I volunteer at the Red Cross, or I volunteer at the United Way, I'm important. Whereas millennials and Gen Z are very much like less concerned about like brand name, or like an institution or organization like historical legacy. They want to know like what you're doing right now and the impact that you have in the community, and drawing a clear line between the work that they do and impact on individual people. So that's something to keep in mind too here. So let's go through some retention and recruiting strategy. So to recruit, you definitely need to have a strong social media presence, and this applies to both Gen Z and millennials, right? Your mission should be front and center for your organization. There should be no guesswork in terms of what your organization does, your organization is trying to accomplish. If a millennial or a member of Gen Z has to guess about what you do as an organization, they're just going to move on to the next organization. And I mean, think about the social media apps that we use for our dating, right? Where we slide left or slide right. That's the exact same way that we think about any organization that we're considering to volunteer in. And the reason being is because our attention spans are pretty short. We crave flexibility, and we crave like instantaneous results. So you need to have a strong social media presence. I would say this too. It's amazing to me how much nonprofit and charitable organizations focus on their website, and they don't focus enough on their social media presence. If you're trying to recruit volunteers from either Gen Z or millennials, you need to focus more on your social media presence than even your website, because a lot of times we don't even look at your website. We just go right to your Facebook page or your Instagram page and see what you have going on there. We want to see what your organization was up to yesterday, the day before, and the day before that. And so that we can see a consistent trend. we really don't care if your website is nice. Sorry to break it to you. For older generations definitely do check out websites, but for younger generations, we're all about the social media stuff. So to retain millennials or Gen Z, you need to provide opportunities that emphasize meaning for the individual, emphasize the ability to make a difference, and then use technology to deliver information. Communicate clear objectives, provide structure and support, and then recognize them on social media. This is probably, and I highlighted this, it's probably like the most important retention strategy in terms of keeping both millennials and Gen Z engaged. Because for us, we do live on our phones. And in order for us to show our activity, we want to be tagged in posts. We want to be copied on your posts that recognize what you're up to, so that we can then retweet or repost and show all of our friends what we're up to, because that's what we like to do. And if we can show that we're volunteering and show the people that we're working with, we're going to do it every time. So if you don't have a strong social media game and you're not doing that, then you're probably going to have a stronger likelihood of losing people from both millennial generation and Gen Z. All right, so that was a lot, and we just got through Gen Z and millennials. So quick recap. So either in the chat or you can just talk out loud. What are some challenges and opportunities during the pandemic that you've had to engage Gen Z and millennials? So you could either answer this as a challenge or as an opportunity that you've unpacked or seen as an opportunity during the pandemic to engage Gen Z and millennials. You could put your answers in the chat. You could just talk out loud.
Well, we have a very elderly population in general at the Ava Gallery and Art Center, and our technical savvy is, I would say, poor. So that is a huge challenge. And I joke about that we practice ageism. We need to. I mean, it seems that there really should be a younger person involved that is more interested in the social media. You know, I'm 63. It would be great to have someone your age involved as the manager, volunteer manager. I think that they'd be much more successful, perhaps, in capturing the interest of Gen Z and millennials. Not that I can't do it, just we're an antiquated organization in some regards.
Gotcha. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think you should have someone that represents a younger generation managing your social media accounts. Another thing that I want to point out real quick, and I'm going to skip some slides real quick so everyone close your eyes. But this is kind of a cool chart. I'm going to show this again at the end, but Gen Zers use fewer platforms on a weekly basis compared to millennials. In terms of like social media use, though, you see YouTube, Instagram is huge with these. Snapchat is also really big. And then look at Facebook. So Gen Z on a weekly basis, only 36% of Gen Z uses Facebook anymore. Whereas 87% of millennials still use Facebook. I'm not on Facebook anymore, but a lot of my friends are. Facebook is still pretty popular with millennials, much more popular with boomers and with Xers. Twitter even is not really being used by Gen Z. It's being 42% is still pretty low for millennials. But you need to have like a multi-pronged approach when you're thinking about the social media accounts that you have. And this is also a really cool chart that I found. But you have Gen Z, millennials, Xers, boomers here. Look at the percentages here. 89% use YouTube. So that's another great feature that you can use. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, that manage social media accounts forget about YouTube, especially in nonprofits and charitable organizations. But YouTube is becoming very, very popular when it comes to creating a brand for your organization and showing what you can do. A lot of these accounts now, I think, well, Facebook definitely does, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and now YouTube does too. They have like 15-minute like reels, like story clips. I suggest definitely using those like every single day. Post a reel on your story of your Instagram, on Facebook. If you don't have TikTok, you should probably get a TikTok now too, especially if you're trying to use or recruit Gen Z. I don't know why TikTok's not on here, but TikTok is really, really popular with Gen Z. It's popular with millennials too, not really with Xers or boomers. But Facebook, 83% for millennials. Xers are using a lot. Boomers use Facebook more than any other social media application. Instagram is one, probably, I think the last time I checked, Instagram and TikTok were the fastest growing social media platforms. So really something to consider here. But we'll jump back to this. I'm going to go through some more slides here. We'll talk about Gen X. Any other opportunities that you see with the pandemic? One thing that I would say right off the bat, I'm going to try to pull up the chat here too, just to see if anything else came in. But right off the bat, one of the things that I would say is that the pandemic and working virtually has definitely enhanced, not diminished, social media use. Social media use has skyrocketed. Online activity has skyrocketed during the pandemic because everyone is working virtually right now. So I saw a comment in here that it's challenging to effectively engage social media to recruit. Okay. Yeah. So it's a challenge for a lot of organizations. And unfortunately, nonprofits and charitable organizations are like late adopters of a lot of the technological advancements that we see in society. Like nonprofits and charitable organizations are always like 5 years behind, like for-profit and businesses. Unfortunately, I think because our market looks a little different than the for-profit markets, that we just adopt technology later than the rest of the world does. But we have to start moving the ball in terms of our adoption of social media. And really, it is a full-time job. I've heard people say, well, we don't have time to do it. Well, if you don't have time and you're like an organization that has 1 or 2 staff, then you need to recruit a volunteer to manage your social media accounts and trust them with doing it. Unfortunately, a lot of nonprofit organizations are being led by people of an older generation, and they're fearful of social media for some reason. There's a lot of skepticism and there's a lot of hesitancy with using social media. And I think it's probably because for a lot of older generations, it's new, right? It's not something that older generations were raised on, but you really do need to hand over the reins and stop monitoring and managing your social media accounts so closely. Like I would say err on the side of producing a lot of activity on your social media accounts than erring on the side of not producing enough. No one's going to unfollow you because you post something every day. If anything, for your recruiting and retaining of younger generations, that's only going to make us engage even more because we are literally addicted to our phones. So definitely start doing that more if you can. All right, so let's move. Yeah, does anyone else have a question?
I was going to point out something we did a couple of years ago, but I think a lot of nonprofits might find it useful. I'm in a very large nonprofit, 400,000 members worldwide, but one of the subunits wanted to get a logo for themselves. So we had a contest for design a logo. We pay, I think it was just 50, but it might have been $500 or something to whoever won the contest. Two winners. The first one was, posted on the point in time we were using Facebook, posted on our Facebook page, and we'll pick a winner we think is best. The second winner was the one to get the most likes on Facebook. That turned out to increase the presence on our page from around 90 to 5,000 people, because it's so easy to game that system. Well, gaming that system connects you with 5,000 people, of which maybe only 1,000 are interested, and maybe only 100 are really good targets, but at least we're visible to that community where we weren't before.
Yeah, that's a really great suggestion. I would say that doing those sort of campaigns on like a bi-monthly basis is a really good idea. And honestly, it's super worth it to have prizes like that in the long run, because you're boosting it's free advertisement really for your organization having a strong social media presence. And so the investment of a $50 gift card or a $100 gift card, whatever it is like pales in comparison in terms of what you receive in terms of benefit. So I think those bi-monthly if you can do a campaign every 3 months like that, I would definitely encourage it. And I would encourage nonprofits too to invest in Facebook advertisement and Instagram advertisement at first to get the ball rolling. The way a lot of these algorithms work for social media accounts is that the more followers you have, the more that you will get, right? Because it's all about traffic. So the more traffic that you can generate on your sites, the more traffic you're going to get. It's literally like that. I don't know if there's a lot of people that read the Bible on here, but there's this parable where Jesus said, he who has more will be given more, and he who has less will be given less. That's literally applies to this situation when it comes to social media. So Jesus was making a statement that he didn't even realize was going to have impact 2,000 years later. But anyways, I digress. Definitely work very, you have to do a lot of work up front to get your social media accounts moving. And I know it seems like a heavy lift at first, but in the long run, it really does sort of manage itself. And there are, God, I forget the name of this application that you can use. It's a website tool where you can schedule social media posts. Emily, I know you know. Do you know the name of that?
Well, Hootsuite is one I've used.
Hootsuite, yeah, exactly. That's the one I was thinking of. But I think you can even schedule posts on Facebook and Instagram now and Twitter. So it's worth it to just do that. Like every week, spend a few hours on Monday or on a Friday just scheduling your posts for the next few weeks so that you get it out of the way. But having that done up front is a super time saver, and it really does have long-term consequences. Unfortunately, for a lot of organizations that are late adopters to social media, they're struggling unnecessarily because they've just been, for whatever reason, reluctant to have a strong social media presence and do the work. But if you, like I said, if you don't have the staff capacity to do this, then recruit volunteers to do this. There's a lot of young volunteers who would love to add to the resume that they are a social media account manager for a nonprofit. Like just sell it on that basis alone, and you're going to get someone immediately who, like an intern, you could sell it as an internship. The high school students, either like freshmen or sophomores in college that are looking for opportunities to engage. It looks like I just lost my slides. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right, so let's move on here. Gen X. Let's talk a little bit about Gen X here. So almost 30% volunteer, more than any other generation. Volunteer a lot of hours too. 48 median hours is the second most of any generation. Less charitable than millennials, only 59% give. A lot of Gen Xers give with their time more than they give with their money. And they will do a little bit of everything, but Gen Xers are really good at fundraising. So when Gen X has to self-identify the kind of projects that they like to work on, they like to fundraise, they like to organize events, and they like to take charge of the things that you give them to do. And we'll get into that a little bit here. So characteristics and needs. Gen Xers were considered for the longest time to be the busiest generation. Definitely you start to see with Gen Xers a very, like, they pioneered the diverse workplace, right? Because a lot of women started entering the workforce as Gen Xers. Certainly we had a lot of boomers that were women that entered the workplace too, but that trend really started to pick up with Gen X. And so especially with women, managing a full-time job, taking care of the family, bringing the kids to soccer practice, to ballet practice, still finding time to volunteer at their kids' school, run food drives, charity drives. Definitely the busiest generation. Because they're the busiest generation, they value time and order, right? Gen Xers right now are filling a lot of management positions. A lot of boomers are transitioning out, they're retiring, they're transitioning out of the workplace, and they're either like going to like a full-time volunteer position or just like staying out of the workplace altogether. And to replace those business leaders and organizers, Gen X is really filling that gap. So busier than ever before, desire balance, categorize life in boxes, the big part of what makes Gen X, Gen X. Definitely smartphone users, 80% own a smartphone, still use email and social media, but definitely use email a lot. Gen X is still email savvy and uses email a lot to communicate. Thrive on independence. They're innovators, they're creators, they want to make systems work better. So one of the things that I recommend to nonprofit leaders and organizers, people that are recruiting volunteers, is that if you recruit someone, if you're looking for someone to come in and make your systems improved, or to run a program, or to organize an event, definitely try to recruit someone from either like Gen X or boomers, because they like to do that kind of stuff. They like to organize, they like to innovate, and they like to improve systems and to make them much more efficient. So let's talk about retention and retaining and recruiting strategies. So to recruit Gen Xers, you need to offer a diverse set of work experiences, right? So offer challenging positions, right? Gen X wants to be challenged by the position. Offer opportunities to create, to develop, to expand projects that are already in existence. So give them a project, have them come in and pretty much hand over the reins to the project and give them ownership of that so that they can use it as an opportunity to advance their career, right? Gen X is very, very much invested in advancing in their career and using all their time really to promote themselves holistically as a professional. So offer goal-oriented tasks, provide flexibility, and value their time, right? If you make it very specific in your job descriptions and your position descriptions, from what time does this position start and what time does this position end, right? For millennials and Gen Z, we're much more flexible in terms of what we can do. So you sort of just leave it up to them to set their own schedule. But for Gen X, they want to know what time the position, what the requirements are of the position, what time the position starts, what time does the position end in terms of responsibilities. Do not micromanage Gen X. You can definitely micromanage Gen Z and millennials, right? We sort of need a hand to hold to guide us through everything that we do. But for Gen X, they're not living with their parents. They moved out very, very early. They've been independent their entire lives. They're great at managing projects, and they're the smartest person in the room, right? We're talking like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and Elon Musk. So even Jeff Bezos, like all the innovators and the leaders in our world right now are representing Gen X. So don't micromanage, give them a project, let them use their expertise to take that project to a place that you never thought was even possible. Communication, definitely you can use social media. It's less important than it is for millennials and Gen Z, but email, you can call them, they will answer. Definitely different from millennials and Gen Z in that respect. And then respect their time. If you say the position is from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. and then they show up and you're not there, that's going to be a big turnoff, and they're going to find somewhere else to volunteer. And then provide feedback, right? Don't tell them they did a bad job, but provide some feedback. And then again, don't micromanage, let them take the reins and let them lead your projects. All right. Any questions there with Gen X before we go into boomers?
I posted one about LinkedIn being a potential connection for that community.
Yeah. That's a really good point. That's something I was going to highlight a little later, but definitely a really good point. Gen X and millennials too are starting to use LinkedIn a lot more. But LinkedIn is like one of the more popular social media platforms for Gen X, and it's really simple. Why? Because Gen X is like, they're right now at the heart of their timeline in terms of career, right? They're trying to advance into upper levels of management. And they really do like to advertise the skills that they have, right? They're going to give you their credentials. They're going to tell you all the certifications that they have. And they want to be able to advertise that on a platform that highlights that and emphasizes that. And LinkedIn is a perfect platform. I think LinkedIn right now has eclipsed every other job recruiting website or platform in the world in terms of people connecting on LinkedIn to find jobs and to find employment. And because Gen Xers right now are raising kids and are putting kids through college and have a lot of financial responsibility, there's a huge emphasis on LinkedIn. And the cool thing about LinkedIn too, and this is something that I use, even if I'm volunteering at an organization or a nonprofit, I still list that volunteer experience in my LinkedIn profile. And a lot of Gen Xers do the same thing. What's interesting now is that because volunteering has become much more, it's become a process, right? Like when you apply, you have to apply for a lot of nonprofits, you have to apply to that nonprofit for a volunteer position. It's much more respected now than it's ever been. And I think a lot of that has to do with the different ways that we're looking at experience. For the longest time, I think professional experience was really gauged by your professional career or your work experience or your performance. And now it's all encompassing. People want to see the skills that you have and recognize that you could have a ton of different skills that are not necessarily tied to your place of employment. So volunteer positions are being listed on LinkedIn. Your certifications are being listed on LinkedIn. The things that you spend your time doing are listed on LinkedIn. And it's amazing, but a lot of Gen Xers are using LinkedIn to sort of tell you what they're up to every single day. So if you have a social media presence on LinkedIn as a volunteer organization, and you give your volunteers that are Gen X the ability to tag themselves in your posts on LinkedIn, or to at least tag your organization on their LinkedIn profile, on their experience board, that's a really great selling point. And like I said, a lot of Xers are using LinkedIn. So Jim, thanks for highlighting that. All right. Boomers. Let's talk about boomers. So boomers were the largest demographic in terms of generation in the US, and now it's millennials, but they're very, very close behind. Still represent a very, very big part of our population, and they represent a huge volunteer base, right? So 25% of boomers volunteer. It's 20 million volunteers nationwide. In terms of what's really interesting about boomers is that even though like there's you would expect more boomers to be volunteering, the ones that do volunteer a lot of hours, right? So in terms of the hours that they look at, the first place, almost 3 billion hours of service, which gives them a huge monetary value of almost $64 billion worth of in-kind value. So again, taking first place in both of those categories. And so if you can get a boomer to volunteer, they pretty much become like a full-time employee in your organization, which is super cool. But it's definitely different than Xers, millennials, and Gen Z. And the reason being is because a lot of boomers are retiring now, so they have a lot more time to give. So the ones that do volunteer invest a lot of time into your organization. They represent 43% of the US's total charitable giving in the country, which is a huge, huge number, right? A lot of boomers like to volunteer in religious organizations, and they like to do a lot of direct service and giving. So characteristics and needs, definitely career-oriented, work focus, believe more hours of work equals better performance. So it's funny because I feel like the term burnout was adopted, probably like started to get adopted by like Gen Xers, and definitely is being adopted by Millennials and Gen Z, where like that is a huge trend. You heard a lot of talk before the pandemic in like HR departments and in organizations talking a lot about burnout, especially in nonprofits where there's a lot of direct service and the work is kind of tough because you're working with people that have a lot of needs. So burnout rates super high. Baby boomers, they don't believe in burnout. You cannot burn them out. They actually think that if you're burned out, then that's a sign of strength. You're doing your job right if you're burned out. So they give a lot of time. They work a lot of hours. Definitely civically minded. They vote. They donate their time. They work in local organizations, and they're invested in their local communities, right? They see themselves as an extension of the community that they live in, and therefore like to spend a lot of time in their communities that they're working in. This is different from like Gen X and Gen Z and millennials, right? Because we can volunteer our time virtually and differently in ways that allow us to travel 20 miles outside the city to work in like a rural volunteer organization. Whereas boomers, they like to stay like local, like within a 5-mile radius of where they live. So that's something to keep in mind too. If you're trying to recruit local volunteers, recruit some boomers, because boomers like to invest in local communities. Another really important thing too is they want to leave their fingerprints, their identity, leave a stamp on an organization, right? So you'll see like people like boomers that will work like 30 years as a volunteer in an organization, right? And they'll only volunteer at that one organization because they become part of the family there. Whereas, and you see this reflected in the way that they work too, in their careers, right? Where they'll work in a organization or a business for 40 years and then retire, right? Whereas Gen X follows some of those trends, but definitely millennials and Gen Z, they really do not care about how long they work in an organization. If you can get a millennial or someone from Gen Z to stay in your organization for more than 5 years, then you have really done some amazing work to keep them there, because we naturally like to jump from one organization to another. Whereas boomers and Xers, but mostly for boomers, they're very like focused on loyalty to an organization, loyalty to a cause. So if you get them, they will stay, especially if they're invested. And this is sort of interesting, right? And I think it's even grown since the last time I did this presentation, but 71% use social media, right? So it's funny because you always hear like boomers complaining about, millennials and Gen Z on their phones, but boomers use Facebook way more than any of us do. And so Facebook has become the social media platform for boomers and Xers. Millennials still use it too, but less. Millennials will definitely use like Snapchat and Twitter and Instagram before they'll use Facebook. Whereas boomers, they use Facebook, right? To communicate now. So that's something to keep in mind. That's a changing trend that we're starting to see. We'll keep moving on here. So some retention and recruitment strategies. So one of the biggest things here is emphasize skills needed. Create leadership opportunities for volunteer positions. Like if you want someone to sort of lead or train a group of volunteers, recruit a boomer to do it, right? Because they're coming into the position thinking that they're the experts in the room, right? And they are the experts in the room in a lot of ways because they have the most experience. So don't give a boomer a menial task, right? Don't give them the volunteer position of, filling in volunteers or keeping track of volunteers when they come into an organization, or managing social media accounts or mailing out letters. Save that for someone else. Give the training opportunities to boomers. Give the opportunities that you have in your organizations to lead to boomers. Recruit boomers for your board of directors, because guess what? Most board of directors, especially in volunteer organizations, are looking for connections to individuals that have money because they're trying to engage folks that have that have charitable interests, that are looking to donate not just their time but their money. And boomers are great connectors for those people, right? So communicate how their expertise is needed. In terms of retention, like I said, invite them to do trainings, to do presentations, and then also publicly recognize their accomplishments, right? Pay them respect. They believe that they are due their respect, right? There's sort of like an old school mentality there, which is awesome. But, you're not going to be recognizing boomers on, Instagram as much as you would like with Gen Z or millennials. You want to recognize them at an event, in person, give them a plaque that they can put on the wall, a certificate, whatever you got to do, just make it known that they're amazing. And like I said earlier, provide work that allows them to use their expertise or skills. So when you're crafting your volunteer position descriptions, you want to emphasize the skills that are needed. So if you want trainings to be led on a set of given topics, say that in your descriptions, right? And you're going to recruit boomers to do that. Through traditionalists real quick. This is the last one, but traditionalists, the generation right before boomers, right? 11 million volunteers, still a big volunteer base, 90 median hours, first place there. 88% donate to charity. So a very, very large percentage of traditionalists will donate. And a lot of the reason I think that might be the case is because they do have access to more money, right? Boomers are retiring. Traditionalists have been retired for like 5 or more years now. It might even be more than that now, like 10 years now. And so they have, they're established financially, so they are more willing to give. Late adopters of email definitely prefer phone calls and actual physical mail, right? Mail that you send out on a piece of paper. They appreciate that. They will open up that letter and they will read it and they will stick it on the refrigerator. Okay. So it's kind of funny, but it's precious. It's amazing. I mean, they represent an older generation, and that's the way that they like to communicate. So communicate with them that way. See themselves as offering wisdom and guidance, strong values, strong work ethic, and no news is good news, right? No feedback is good feedback. They want to show up, do their volunteer duty, and then they like to leave. And if you communicate with them, send them a postcard or something in the mail, right? And a lot of them still have landlines, okay? I remember landlines, but they all have landlines and they all have answering machines. So if you want to get in touch with them, leave them a message on their answering machine. They will listen to it and they will call you back.
And they have tablets and Hotmail.
Yeah, right, exactly. All right, so some recruitment and retention strategies here. This is a really cool one for me, but mentoring. And there's some really cool senior programs out there, like the Senior Companion Program. There's also the Foster Grandparent Program that some of you might be aware of. But some of these folks really like to, take young people under their wing and mentor them and support them, right? So offer mentoring opportunities. You can post your opportunities, volunteer opportunities in the paper or local community centers, because they will go into a coffee shop or the local diner and they will look at that styrofoam or that cork board that's up on the entrance with all the posters there. They're the only ones that will read it. Boomers will read it too, but definitely not Gen Z or millennials. We're not going to look at the cork board at the library and see what the opportunities are, but they will. So post them there if you're trying to recruit volunteers from an older generation. Offer opportunities that don't really require the use of technology. They find it troubling if you are sending a lot of communication through email, or if you ask them if they got the email, they're going to say, no, of course I didn't get the email. Did you send me a letter? Did you call me? No, we don't really do that anymore. Well, you're going to have to do that if you're trying to recruit traditionalists into your organization. Retaining them. Like I said before, no news is good news. Communicate on the phone, through mail. Don't require them to use technology or social media. They're not really on social media accounts. Make them feel that their knowledge is sought after and needed. Let them mentor younger generations. So if you like need tutoring positions, or if you need mentoring volunteer positions, these are the right folks for you, right? Okay, so all right, so I promised I'd talk a little bit about social media, but this is social media used by every generation. Like I said before, and I just checked this data today, but the trends are going like everyone is using social media now. Whereas like if you would have asked me 3 or 4 years ago, you would have had a chart that had like an upward trend like this, where like Gen Z, millennials here, and then as you go up in age, a decline in social media use. We're not seeing those trends anymore. Everyone is using social media. So look at these numbers. Obviously, Gen Z is using social media the most, millennials, but baby boomers, like I said, baby boomers are on Facebook. They use Facebook a lot. So definitely use social media for recruiting from all those different generations. All right, what else do we have here? I showed you this slide. This is sort of an important slide if you're thinking about Gen Z and millennials. I put these in here because I think they're nice charts to use. You'll have access to the slides.
This is awesome. I just noticed the time and we have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah.
And there was
at the end. So
you're good. There was a couple questions in the chat too.
Yeah. So I'm just going to highlight this one last thing before we get to some questions. But this is a really cool chart that you can use. Clash points, pretty much everything that we went over is in this chart. So it's like a quick reference guide for you as well. I definitely recommend checking that out. I had a discussion here, but we won't get into that. I'll leave the chart up, and then we'll get into some questions. So what do we have for questions? Yeah, go ahead.
My only question is, will there be a link to this recording? It should be required for everybody here at at the Ava Gallery and Art Center.
I believe so, right? Amber, Emily,
there
recording?
Will be a link to this recording that will be available.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you ever want me to talk to any of your folks, I'm more than willing to do that as well.
Cool.
All right, one problem we have on the board is that they do not understand the importance of social media. Oh, you're referring to your board of directors.
Yeah, you can ignore that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How does developing social capital play out with Jim? Do you want to sort of like talk a little bit about that? What you meant by that?
Yeah, I can expand on that. This is Robert Putnam's bowling alone idea, more recently updated in his book, The Upswing. A lot of the volunteer work builds social capital that then people use to initiate other volunteer work or other for-profit organizations at times. There's a lot of interesting examples. It's been declining over the last 40 years. And before that, it was increasing dramatically over the last 40 years. And one of the characteristics is really a longer term engagement with people through a church organization, through a bowling club, through book clubs, through anything that actually brings them together and gives them an opportunity to interact with each other over time. Obviously, nonprofit volunteering has a great opportunity to do that. But if people don't stay around in that particular organization, they're not going to build those connections. So that's why I'm wondering if that plays out the same way with the younger generations.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about the social capital stuff. Here's the thing. These younger generations the bowling clubs and the social clubs are less relevant, right? Like all that is happening online now. So I really encourage organizations to create groups on their social media accounts that these younger generations can tap into and communicate on that. In terms of social capital, I think I sort of understand your point. It's sort of tough to say because I think one of the drivers for strong social capital is communication, right? When people are able to have relationship, they're able to communicate. I think you see stronger social capital there. And I think a lot of times we've associated social capital in like a local community environment, right? You know, your neighbors knowing each other. And like if John knows a mechanic and you need your car fixed, you can go to John because he knows a mechanic. And then, you know, the mechanic needs something so that maybe you have a skill that you can provide to him in return. I think we're seeing less of that in terms of it being communicated that way. I think you might be able to say that we have stronger social capital now than ever before because we're able to communicate with literally anyone, any place, anywhere. And so instead of, you know, looking to recruit folks locally, you could recruit people like literally all over the world. I mean, AmeriCorps is a great example of this, right? Whereas AmeriCorps will recruit volunteers from all over the country. I think in New Hampshire, it was like 50% of the AmeriCorps volunteers that serve in the state are from out of state. So maybe our social capital has expanded. I don't know. I think
Putnam's recent book has actual statistical metrics for tracking these things. And the problem is it's not just communications, it's trust. And trust is built up over time. And that's been declining dramatically.
yes, I think you're probably right about that. Maybe we've expanded our ability to communicate, but we have not expanded in terms of how we're able to trust each other. And I think that's a really, really important point. So identifying unique ways to build that trust, especially with younger generations through an online presence, is a really, really important skill to have. And I really do think like trust is built with more content. So like the more content you have on your page, the more live videos that you have, the more stories that you're able to add to your Instagram, Facebook accounts. Even LinkedIn has story mode now where you can post to your story and it's up there for 24 hours and you could show a trend, a consistent trend of impact. I think that might be one way to build trust there. I know we're over time.
Yeah. Jed, thank you for this. This is such awesome content. I think we could keep going for another hour. I saw you put your contact in the chat, so please find his email address there. And Jed, it sounds like you're really available to be reached out to. That's
definitely. I love working with folks, and I've done this presentation to a lot of organizations. So let me know if you would like me to do it for you as well.